coronavirus outbreak has been around for 7 months. In this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I talk with a family practice physician, Dr. David Albenberg, to see what's going to happen next. And be sure to like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook and subscribe to my Quintin Washington YouTube channel as well. Dr. David Albenberg, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks for having me, Quintin.
You're very welcome. I understand that you are a family practice physician here in Charleston. Talk to me about your position and what's that like these days?
I am a family doctor at Access Healthcare. We have a primary care and urgent care, Access Urgent, on Calhoun Street downtown. Our practice has been here for 18 years.
18 years.
We see we have 550 regular patients that call this their medical home, as well as we're the urgent care for downtown for, the college kids and the tourists, and of course our 550 patients.
And what is the biggest difference between 18 years ago and right now when you think of Access Healthcare?
Right, so we have what's called a concierge medical practice. Our patients pay us by the year whether we see them or not. It was a very unique concept when we got started in 2002, and now it's fairly commonplace. So what's different is that we no longer have to educate our patients about what we do. They're actually coming looking for a practice like this, one in which we kind of slow down and spend our time with our patients, and we have a much smaller volume of patients, and our practice is designed to be more attentive and to have relationships.
And what's your relationship like with the patients?
Well, I guess you'd have to ask them. From my standpoint, it's it's why we went into medicine as doctors, to have these relationships over time. And I've been doing this long enough that I'm actually starting to reap the rewards of some of those relationships going on 25 years. What's the relationship like? It's great. We're growing old together, and I think that was the way it was meant to be back in the day when medicine was what it once was.
What is medicine now?
It's transactional. Patients kind of come and go wherever their insurance changes, and we're seeing a lot of that now, of course, with people's jobs changing. And so there's not a lot of allegiance, not a lot of continuity, and there's not a lot of investment, frankly, in that relationship either way. And so even though I'm not participating in these, the traditional, we'll call it traditional practice of medicine any longer, it's over the last 18 years gotten, I think, quite a bit worse in that regard.
And you talk about, people changing jobs and whatnot. I want to talk to you about, obviously, COVID, because you sent out an email newsletter a couple of weeks ago, and it was sent to me. And you basically talked about COVID. You said this: Armageddon is definitely, probably, more than likely, possibility, never coming, and more on the new norms of hypocrisy, ambivalence, absurdity, contradiction, and judgment. What are the new norms right now, doctor?
Yeah, so you're talking about over the last 18 years, or over the last 7 months? What we've seen in the last 7 months is that no one really knows how to be in regards to this virus, and that goes for patients for sure, but I think also doctors are having a really hard time figuring out how to be consistent in terms of how we address this virus. There's so many unknowns that although I think patients come to doctors for their expertise, the truth is that we don't really know. And so I think in a setting of misinformation or no information, we'll call it, there's a lot of hypocrisy. It's comical, actually, if you look at it that way. We're living in that environment right now. I think that this pandemic started off with a tremendous amount of anxiety relating to that unknown, and which heightened even from there, if it could, through the months of April and June, when we were actually starting to see our first wave, and to now, which thankfully I think that we dealt at least with the initial anxiety relating to this, and now we can get to business actually treating the patients that do have this virus. So at least we're coming out of that initial anxiety, but with it came all of those terms that went into the title of that newsletter.
And you talked earlier about 7 months of COVID. How do you address that now?
How do we address what?
COVID.
How are we addressing the virus now?
Yes, sir.
Tell me what do you mean?
Okay, you just mentioned about addressing how people don't know how to address COVID. It's been 7 months since this virus began. How do you address it now?
Well, I think now we're actually dealing with more of the nuts and bolts of the actual virus. So like people are, are getting the virus, they're getting sick. We're seeing them through the illness, and there's less what I describe as talking people down from bridges, so there's less of the anxiety component of, how should I navigate my life through this? I think people are finding their bearings, and they're finding ways to navigate. And so now that leaves us to actually deal with the virus and the testing associated with that.
And let me get back to the newsletter and what you wrote. You said this quote: "The point is this pandemic has leveled the playing field. Those that knew no longer know. Those that never knew still don't. The thing is, we all don't know. And what we do know what we don't know. We ask people that we think know and empower them with our decision making, even though they don't know either." Let me ask you this, doctor. Who have you been talking to lately about COVID?
Right. So, I have my colleagues, of course, and, we have our interactions. But the thing is, I think it's important to realize that your doctor, me, and whoever your doctor is, we're reading the same stuff that you're reading. And so I think we're right there with you in terms of our not knowing. And so I think that was my main point of the newsletter, is that we're trying to stay current as well, but that we're living in a whole new world of ignorance.
And let me continue. You said this quote. I'll give you an example. Anthony Fauci, top of his class at Stanford and Cornell, not a tall man at 5'7", but captain of his high school basketball team. At 79, still an avid runner, definitely my kind of guy. The guy knows infectious diseases. He knows immunology. He knows that if we all hide inside for the next year, the virus will eventually give up and find another unwelcoming, unsuspecting host. But even at 79, Fauci has never lived through a pandemic either. He likely has no training in pandemic management. The best policy practices from prior pandemics are any type of background as actuary, economist, or risk maker. Still, for some bizarre reason, we all look to him for the solution to end this crisis. It's not enough to say, wear your masks, socially distance, shut down the economy, and stay home for a year. He just doesn't know. Let me ask you this, doctor. What is enough?
What is enough?
Yes, sir.
What do you mean, what is enough?
Okay, let me reread this. Still, for some...
No, I got it. I wrote it. I get it. But what do you mean, what is enough?
Still, for some bizarre reason, we all look to him, Fauci, for solution to the end of the crisis. It's not enough to say, wear your masks, social...
Oh, I see. Oh, what is enough?
So
yeah, I mean, I don't think we know. I don't think we know what the best practices are in negotiating and maneuvering our way through this pandemic, this crisis that we're going through. Certainly, we know how to slow down and stop the virus. We proved that here in Charleston better than anywhere. I think we never really had a first wave. We flattened the curve so much that it was we weren't seeing any COVID, at least not in my practice. And so we definitely know how to flatten a curve. I think the question then and still is, how flat does it need to be? What is the vaccine really going to be the end point of that? And if so, is our goal now to get to the vaccine? Are we still trying to flatten the curve? These are questions that I think are unanswerable.
And doctor, let me ask you this. What are the current stats on COVID?
What stats?
What are the current stats? What are you hearing? What are the number of cases and whatnot? What are you hearing?
Are we talking in Charleston or nationwide or internationally?
In Charleston.
Yeah, I mean, I think Charleston is mirroring other places where, we're getting back up on another upswing. I don't think, and that we're seeing that nationally. Certainly we're seeing it in Europe. I don't think it's of any great surprise because of, school getting back into session and colder months and, possibly influenza beginning in some of the Eastern European countries. So I think for these reasons, we're going to start to see higher numbers for sure.
And when I interviewed Dr. Pat Cawley over at MUSC, obviously MUSC CEO, he basically told me a couple of weeks ago, he's scared because this might mix in with the flu and cold season.
it will mix in with it. I mean, we're preparing ourselves for that. I think any urgent care, primary care ought to be of how we're going to deal with these comorbidities and differentiating between them, and God forbid them coming together. Because if we see a patient that has both with the right risk factors, it's going to be tough.
Tough. And you also said this too, quote, antibody previous infection testing. Now, new data seems to show that the duration of the antibody response seems to correlate directly with the intensity and duration of symptoms. And at most, 3 to 6 months, which seems to be about the same time that we remain immune from other coronaviruses such as the common cold. What else is data showing you?
Well, I think my point there is that, and this was really meant to be kind of an optimistic end to the newsletter, is that that the herd immunity that we've been talking about, the number of 50 to 70% of individuals having antibodies, was probably accurate, but I think that we were looking at the wrong thing. And the real player here is going to be the B cells and the T cells that are inferring immunity to those that we can't measure. And so in the New York Times, I think there was a reference in the article, wrote a piece about how we may be much closer to herd immunity, but we can't measure B cells and T cells like we can antibodies. Antibody testing has been available since the very beginning of the pandemic. It's cheap, it's quick, but it's not the eye on the prize that we had thought. So it is possible, if the goal is to get to herd immunity, which, the goal may be to get to the vaccine to get to herd immunity, then we may be much closer than we thought. The new data that I've just read is that we've gone from 2% incidence rating or prevalence of the antibodies in June to now 9%, which of course is still very far away from the 60 to 70% that we'll need for herd immunity. But again, I think that I keep hearing about many individuals who, of course, believe that they are immune because they believe they had a COVID-like illness, but don't have antibodies and have been around people, et cetera, and have not actually gotten the verifiable virus. And so that sort of furthers my belief that if we could, we need to be measuring the T and the B cells, but I'm told that that's not really going to be possible.
And how far off is the antibody testing?
How far off
is the antibody testing in your mind?
No, we are doing antibody testing currently, and we have from the beginning. But I don't think B or T cell testing will really ever take place. It's not something that's really possible on a broad scale basis. It's really for the lab.
Okay. And you also talk about tests of current. You said this current. You said this quote: during the height of the spike in Charleston early this summer, we were briefly retesting those that were positive 10 days out from their initial positive test, only to find that half was still positive, even if they didn't have any symptoms. How many retests were occurring this summer?
Well, initially we were asking people to come in for test of cure, which means that if they tested positive, we asked them to stay quarantined until we tested them again. And as I mentioned, half would test negative when their symptoms resolve. But since then, we've learned that is somewhat absurd, because what we're measuring really is viral DNA, and the viral DNA may be present for a lot longer than the virus is, the active virus, I should say. And so we're no longer doing tests of cure, and we're recommending that others don't as well.
What do you expect to happen in the next 6 months?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to see another curve for sure. We are seeing another curve. We should see another curve. We're, getting back to, we're becoming less vigilant, I think, as a society. And so I think we're going to have, more cases, more casualties. And I think that eventually in the next, we'll say 3 months, we'll see a vaccine that will get through the FDA and that will be acceptable to, to us at least, so that people can begin to work on getting closer to that herd immunity, that number that we're trying to get to.
Dr. David Albenberg, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thanks, Quintin, for having me.
Thank you.